Zoo-wee mama, I'm here to talk about the new season pass card for the April season of Marvel Snap. I'm talking about Baron Zemo, who might just create a whole new archetype for us in Marvel Snap, which is very exciting, and I'm going to get more into that. Now, as of the time I'm making this video, this is still data mined. We do not have the official season announcement yet, but coming on April 2nd, we have the Zeros to Heroes season. Baron Zemo currently showing as a 3-cost, 5-powered card with the on-reveal ability to recruit the lowest cost card from your opponent's deck to your side of this location. And by recruiting, you will be stealing that card from your opponent, so it removes it from their deck and it automatically plays it right next to Baron Zemo. So I'm going to give my thoughts on his abilities, his best synergies, 3 decks that you can try out right after he releases, and I'll just give my overall ratings and review. So let's go ahead and get started with his best synergies. So to start off, Baron Zemo has great synergy with a card like Yondu and any card that will remove stuff from your opponent's deck. Now, Yondu has been changed to destroy the lowest cost card in your opponent's deck, which is actually very nice because you first play Yondu, their lowest cost is destroyed, and then when you play Zemo, he's now pulling like the second lowest cost that would have been in there. And other cards like Gladiator or Cable work really well because you're just taking stuff out of your opponent's deck, and if you can take enough stuff out, you might be able to mill them. And by that, I mean you might be able to take out enough cards that they miss a draw. Maybe by turn 6, they don't get a draw because you took all their cards out of their deck. That's pretty funny. Next up, we've got cards like Maximus. Well, if their deck is empty, Maximus has no downside, okay? Or if you play Maximus before their deck is empty, you might only leave them with 1 or 2 cards, and then Baron Zemo can just pull something really big. I mean, if the only thing left in their deck is like She-Hulk and Infinite, then Baron Zemo's gonna pull one of them, so that's awesome. And then lastly, something like Blue Marvel could work. Okay, Blue Marvel, Mockingbird, Dazzler, they just work with cards that spawn other cards. And so Baron Zemo is pulling something and playing it at the same time. That takes up 2 board spaces, so it's 2 targets for Blue Marvel. It's helping out Dazzler, and it's a card that didn't start in your deck, so it would discount Mockingbird. So he has a bit of this Zoo synergy as well. Now let's get into the good and the bad for Baron Zemo. So to start with the good, he's got good stats. I mean, he's a nice 3-5. That means at his worst, when he's at, his floor, which we'll talk about more in the next slide, he's just solid. I mean, he's just going to add power to the board even when he doesn't pop off and pull something crazy. He mills your opponent, and again, this is the term for just taking cards out of your opponent's deck to the point that they might actually miss a draw. This comes from Magic the Gathering, the card Millstone, I believe, and if I'm incorrect, someone will correct me in the comments, but I believe the card was Millstone in Magic the Gathering that like burned 1 or 2 cards from your opponent's deck. And then you do get to see what is stolen. Obviously, it gets played to your side of the board, so you know what you took, you know what your opponent no longer has, and that can just be some valuable information. He can produce standalone value, so if you don't have a deck that synergizes with him, maybe you're not going for this full mill type deck that I've been talking about, that's okay. He might just end up being good stats and pull something solid and just produce good power. He doesn't require other cards to get good value, and that's a very good thing. And then, of course, he can just pull big cards, okay? If your opponent has 1 or 2 cards left in their deck, as I mentioned, and they're just big cards, Baron Zemo's going to get it, okay? If the lowest cost card is something that's 4, 5, or 6 costs, Baron Zemo's going to pull it, and that could produce some insane value. So turns 5 or 6 specifically, he might go big. Now, to talk about the bad side of Baron Zemo, first up, this is RNG heavy. You don't know what he's going to pull unless you've seen your opponent's entire deck in Conquest, but even then, you don't know which cards they drew. I mean, if they drew their 1-cost cards, maybe he's pulling a 2-cost. If they didn't draw their 1-cost, then he's, pulling a 1-cost. You just don't know, okay? And this can be risky. If you're against a discard deck, what if you pull Blade and he discards a card in your hand that you wanted, right? I mean, there's just a bit of risk here, and sometimes it's just kind of useless if you get like Wolverine or Deadpool, but you're not playing Destroy. And this makes it difficult to snap. A lot of cards, if they're about to produce big value, you snap and then you play the card. maybe you're a discard player and you're about to play Ghost Rider. Well, you can snap and then play Ghost Rider, and you know Ghost Rider is getting something big. With Zemo, you don't know, okay? And if he does get something big, like you get lucky with Infinite because your opponent only has big stuff left, well, you snap after and your opponent sees they got Infinite, and so they're just going to retreat now, okay? So he's difficult to take advantage of his best pulls because you really don't know ahead of time. He does require 2 board spaces, so this is a bit problematic. There will be times where you just don't have space, or if you're leaving a space for Baron Zemo's pull, whatever card he's going to get, then you might not play a different card, right? Instead of playing these 2 cards, you're going to say, okay, I'm going to play Zemo and hold this other card in hand so Zemo has space. So it will feel limiting sometimes, especially if you're playing him on turn 5 or 6. And then you can't mill too much. If you destroy too many cards in your opponent's deck and they have no more cards left, well, Baron Zemo pulls nothing, okay? So you want to mill cards to increase his chance of getting something good, but you don't want to mill too many cards. And if there's draw involved, maybe locations, drew 1 or 2 cards for your opponent, they might just run out of cards in their deck. And I think he's better off curve, okay? And so this is kind of bad. He will get his best value if you play him later in the game. Your opponent just has a higher chance that they drew all of their cheap cards. And so on turns 5 or 6, he'll get the most value, but he's a 3-cost card. In terms of tempo, you want to play him on turn 3, okay? And if you're playing him on turn 6, you don't know what he's going to get. You can't calculate for that on the board. If you're trying to do the math, can you win the lane? Unless you know the last card in your opponent's deck, you can't use that for math. So that makes it a bit tough. But now, let's dive in to Baron Zemo's floor and ceiling. So if you watch any of my recent card prediction videos, you might have heard me talking about a card's floor and ceiling a lot, and I've decided to start visualizing it, okay? I think this might be the most important factor in trying to predict if a new card is going to be good or not. You need to value a card at its worst, at its best, and know where it often lies, okay? Where the consistency is. So in terms of the floor, this is Baron Zemo at his worst, okay? At his reasonable worst, you will have games where he's at his floor. He's on a real do nothing. He's just a 3/5, okay? If your opponent's deck is empty, he's doing nothing. If your side of the location is full once you play Zemo and there's no space for him, he's doing nothing. He's just stats on the board. You will have games, if you're playing Zemo, you will have games where this occurs, where he is just stats and doing nothing. So it's important to recognize this. Now, that's not horrible. It's above the line of being viable, is what I'm saying. It's, 5 power, that's solid stats, okay? It's solid. It's not like you've got Grandmaster or Mr. Negative, where if you can't pull off their ability, you're just going to keep them in hand because they literally add 0 or -1 power to the board. It's still 5 power. There's going to be some situations where you can't do anything, but he's still just your biggest power play at the time that you can fit in with your energy. So he's viable, but it is below the line of being competitive. Okay, you would never purposely put a 3/5 with the ability to do nothing in your deck. You would play Polaris or Spider-Man. You'd play a 3/5 that actually does something. You would not play Zemo. So it's not a terrible floor, but it's not good either, right? It's just okay. It's viable, but it's not competitive. Now, what about his ceiling? What is Baron Zemo at his reasonable best? A best that you could achieve, okay? Not just some 1 in 1,000 scenario in game where everything lines up. No, something that will actually be achieved in some matchups or scenarios. Well, he pulls something really big like Infinite. Okay, there will be games where you play Baron Zemo. If you're playing him later in the game, specifically maybe on turns 5 or 6, he's going to pull 6-cost card at times. He just will, okay? If you're against a hella discard deck, they just have a lot of 6-cost cards in their deck. And if you've milled some things, you might pull Infinite, okay? Or even Giganto or Magneto, and that's going to be crazy, okay? If you do pull Infinite, he's essentially a 3/25 that takes up 2 spaces. Now, if he could consistently do this, that would be insane, because this is above the line of being overpowered. So this is a very strong ceiling. Now, where does he often lie? Okay, that's really the question here. We see he has this big range, much bigger than most cards have, but where will he often be? Well, I think if you play Baron on turn 3, which is, he's a 3-cost card, that's right on curve, he's often going to get like a 2-cost card. Okay, you're probably playing him in a deck that has Yondu and Cable. So you're trying to kill, one card in your opponent's deck at least before you play Baron Zemo. There are a lot of decks that just don't run any 1-cost cards. Okay, if you're against Thanos, they have a ton, right? They got the Infinity Stones. But there are a lot of decks that just don't have any 1-cost cards. And so Baron Zemo is often going to get a Zabu or a Jeff. Okay, just a 2-cost card. And he will be a 3/7 with an ability. Okay, if you pull Zabu, you now get to use Zabu's ability. If you pull Jeff, you now have Jeff's ability that you can move him. And he takes up 2 card spots. And I would say this is just above the line of being competitive. Okay, there is randomness here, so it's a bit risky. But in terms of being stats, if you could play Baron Zemo that pulls a Zabu every time, like that's pretty good. Okay, you can't guarantee you're going to be able to use the ability of the 2-cost card you pull, but you're getting stats, you're getting ability. If you have cards like Blue Marvel or Mockingbird that are getting a benefit from having a second card pulled from Zemo, then that's really nice. So it's expected in turn 3. I think reasonably he can pull a 2-cost card, and that's just above the line of being competitive, although there's randomness involved, so it's hard to predict. If you play him on turn 5 or 6, and if you've milled maybe now 1, 2, or even 3 cards, your opponent might just have 1 or 2 cards left in their deck. I think it could reasonably pull a 3-cost card. You might get something like a Hope Summers. Okay, she's very popular right now, so I use her as the example. Or a different 3-cost card. In this case, a Baron Zemo would come out to having effective stats as a 3-cost 9-powered card with an ability, still taking up 2 spaces on the board. And so this is pretty strong, right? If you could play a 3/9 like that, that would be solid. Now you're playing it later in the game, so if you play it on turn 6 and you pull Hope Summers, you don't get to use Hope Summers' ability because it's the last turn. And so again, you cannot rely on being able to use the ability of the card you pull, but sometimes you will be able to, and that's just important to recognize. So I think he is better played on turn 5 or 6, but I think on average, he is a bit above the line of being competitive. He will be competitive, but not overpowered. There are scenarios where he will pop off and he will be super OP, in those specific scenarios in those games. But overall, on average, I think he's kind of in the middle. I think he's right above the line of being competitive, but it's still random. It's hard to plan around, and so that makes it difficult to rely on. That's where I see his floor, his ceiling, and where he will likely fall. Now, let's get into the 3 decks that I've put together for Baron Zemo. So first up, I have this full mill Zemo list. Our main goal here is to mill our opponents, okay? Remove cards from their deck. This is the new archetype that I'm talking about, where, we've got some pieces already in the game. We've got the Yondu, the Cable, the Gladiator. You can double stuff up with Grandmaster or Absorbing Man, but Baron Zemo is just one more piece, and you now have enough to kind of consistently make your opponent miss a turn 6 draw at least. So that's the whole purpose of this deck. We've got Maximus in here. If we play him later and our opponent has no cards, he's got no downside. Or even if we play him early, we're emptying out their deck and Baron Zemo has a higher chance of pulling something really big and juicy. And we've got Dr. Octopus in here. Now, I'm of course am a big fan of Dr. Octopus, but this is going to be good because if your opponent's deck is empty and if they're playing something cheaper, maybe it's like a Surfer deck or any kind of cheaper deck where they have a lot of cards that they can play in one turn, you could empty their hand with a Dr. Octopus play. If they just have 3 or 4 cards in hand in a pretty open lane, you empty their hand on turn 5, and if you emptied their deck, they've got no cards in hand, and they draw nothing on turn 6, they've got nothing to play. It's going to be pretty crazy, so I'm definitely excited for this deck. Let's get into the next one. So here is a Loki deck that I've gone ahead and just put Baron Zemo in. Okay, I took my Loki deck, took out Mobius, put in Baron Zemo. That's simple, but I think it works pretty well. I mean, Baron Zemo is generating a card, so that will give a discount to Mockingbird. And of course, we've just got normal Loki shenanigans. Okay, Loki currently likes Cable because Cable is bringing a card to your hand, which is good for Loki. You want a nice full hand to replace and steal your opponent's stuff. So you get so much intel with Cable and Baron. We've got a ton of card generation still. Mockingbird's getting discounts. The other cards are still getting discounts through Quinjet. So I think Baron fits right in, and he could just add a lot of power, right? Again, if you get lucky and you pull something pretty big from your opponent, maybe you get a Gladiator or something, that's just gonna go crazy. And my last deck is this Tempo Zemo list. Okay, now I've been playing a deck very, very similar to this. It's been working wonders for me in ranked mode, in Conquest. I took out Luke Cage, put in Zemo, and I took out Legion and put in Blue Marvel. Okay, so this deck, Zemo just fits right in because we've got Mysterio and Brood. They just add cards to the board, so that fills up your board to power up a Dazzler who can become a 2/8. It also discounts Mockingbird. Okay, Zemo adds on to that. Zemo's taking up 2 spaces, which is great for Dazzler. Zemo's given a discount to Mockingbird. Now we have Blue Marvel in here to just power stuff up. Maximus is good. Again, we can play him later on, or just even if we did get him out early, that might help Zemo get something big. You slap down the hood, you Killmonger it, and you can kill your opponent's stuff, and then you play your Demon later, which can also discount Mockingbird. So this deck, it just goes really hard. It's super good. You just get nice early advantage and try to just kind of tempo out and steamroll your opponent. So I'm definitely excited to try this one out. So now it's time for me to give my final thoughts and ratings for my Baron Zemo prediction. Now this is the variant you will get for Baron Zemo if you do buy the season pass and unlock the level 50 season pass reward. Now in terms of being fun, I think he's really fun. I think his fun level is amazing. Again, I think we have a new archetype package. I think it was just missing one more card that fit into the curve well enough to really make it viable. In terms of being flexible, you know, I think his flexibility is good, okay? Again, you can play this mill deck that I've been talking about, but you can also play like the other list I showed. You can just play him in Loki. You can just play him in whatever, because he's a powerful card. He's a 3/5. If he pulls something that's 2 or 3, he's now a 3/7 or 3/8. Gladiator is a 3/8. Gladiator sees a good amount of play, okay? He just has good power, and he does not need synergy to power up. Now, in terms of being competitive, I think he's okay. I think he has the potential to be good, but the RNG aspect is really tough to deal with, and it really depends on what your opponent is playing. Okay, if you're playing a Loki deck, the good thing about Loki is you're copying a bunch of cards, and you're getting a discount on them, and they go to your hand. If you get cards that would hurt you, you would just not play them. Baron Zemo, you know, he might pull Carnage. If you're against a destroy deck, he might just pull Carnage and kill himself, okay? He might kill your other stuff. He might pull a Killmonger. He might pull a Blade that discards something from your hand or pull 0. He's going to have times where he pulls something that kind of screws you over, but he's also going to have times where he hits his ceiling, like I talked about, okay? But it's just not super consistent. And on average, I don't think he's generating enough value to be worth the inconsistency. Gladiator is a 3/8 that's pulling a random card from your opponent's deck to try and destroy, but Gladiator is always a 3/8, and he's never popping up something on your side of the board that could, you know, kill your cards, right? He's never carnaging himself. And so Zemo's different in that sense. His RNG is much heavier, I'll say, than some other cards we have in the game. It's riskier. It's just riskier. In terms of would I get him or not, well, he's a season pass card. My vote is yes. I always say if you do spend money on Marvel Snap or you're planning to spend money, always buy the season pass. Okay, that is the best spot for your money. You get the most bang for your buck. You get the most resources for the dollars you put in. If you're going to buy anything, just one thing in Marvel Snap, you buy the season pass. And if you normally buy the season pass, don't skip on this one. I think Zemo is going to be fun. He's a bit hard to replace if he does, you know, end up seeing a good amount of play. And it's just a cool card, okay? It's just a cool card. It's with the season pass. It's going to be worth it. And I'm really excited for him. I really am. He's not game breaking. He's not going to change the meta much, in my opinion. But he's going to be really cool. So let me know what you think about Baron Zemo in the comments below. What decks you're excited to try him out with, or what combos, and what card do you think he's going to pull most often? All right, what card is going to be the most consistently pulled card when you play Baron Zemo? What is he pulling out of your opponent's deck? Is it Zabu? Is it Jeff? Is it some, you know, one-cost card? If your opponent's playing a Baron Zemo, maybe you pull their Yondu or something. I don't know. So let me know what you guys think. And until then, stay positive. I'll see you next time.